2024, the Crossroads Police Department's incident log records a single sterile line. Officers assisted with traffic control during a scheduled tree trimming operation on a partially closed roadway. That's it. That's the official paper trail. A tree got trimmed. Some cones got placed. Nothing to see here. Except 30 minutes later, a man named Carl Jones was face down in handcuffs on a public road, and an internal investigation would later conclude that his arrest never should have happened at all. Picture this: 2 orange cones and a parked patrol car, lights flashing, sitting in the middle of a 2-lane road, and not a single officer standing in the roadway to tell drivers which way to go. That's the entire visual anchor for this case. Not a riot, not a high-speed chase, just an empty gap where direction should have been, and a driver left to guess his way through it. Everything that follows in this video happens because that gap was never filled. Before we go deeper into what the documents actually show, make sure you're subscribed to Police Misconduct Case, because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence. Let's translate the legal language first, because the citations Officer Haley Holbert would later invoke sound a lot more serious than what actually happened on that road. Impeding traffic sounds like Carl Jones brought rush hour to a standstill. In plain English, it means driving too slowly. Interference with public duties sounds like obstruction of justice. In plain English, it means an officer felt disobeyed. Resisting arrest sounds like a fight. In plain English, under Texas law, it can mean nothing more than pulling your arm away from someone's grip. Keep those translations in your head, because every charge filed against Carl Jones that day will eventually collapse under the weight of what those words actually require, not what they sound like they require. Carl Jones approached a closed lane, refused a lawful order to back up, became confrontational, refused to identify himself during a valid traffic stop, and physically resisted arrest. 4 clean boxes, 4 clean charges, 4 clean justifications for putting a man in handcuffs on the side of a road. That's the story Officer Holbert told her supervisor over the radio in real time. That's the story written down. That's the story that was supposed to end the conversation. Now here's the irony explosion. 3 days later, the Crossroads Chief of Police didn't accept that story. He assigned Sergeant Tyler, the very supervisor Carl Jones spent 20 minutes on a hot roadside demanding to speak with, to conduct a formal, documented review of the arrest. And when that review came back, it didn't just question Officer Holbert's judgment. It dismantled her legal basis entirely. The investigation found that the elements of interference with public duties were never satisfied because Carl Jones did not act with criminal negligence. It found that he did not impede traffic because he complied with the order to stop and the order to back up. And in the words of the department's own internal finding, the detention and arrest of Carl Jones were unwarranted. Because this is where controlled, evidence-based analysis matters more than outrage. Under the Texas Transportation Code, impeding traffic requires driving so slowly that you obstruct the normal and reasonable flow of vehicles. Carl Jones stopped, asked clarifying questions, and then backed his vehicle out of the lane before any other car was blocked. That is not impeding traffic. That is, at most, a driver pausing for 10 seconds to understand an unmarked obstruction, which, under the law, is not a crime. Under Section 38.15 of the Texas Penal Code, interference with public duties requires that a person act with criminal negligence, meaning they ought to have been aware of a substantial and unjustifiable risk and grossly deviated from how an ordinary person would act. Carl Jones, by his own account and consistent with what the footage shows, attempted to comply with confusing and contradictory instructions in real time while asking questions about why he was being detained. So ask yourself the question this case is actually built around. Not, did Carl Jones break the law, but this. If the officer enforcing the law cannot correctly identify what the law requires, who is actually impeding the lawful flow of that roadway? That's the thriller question buried inside a routine traffic stop. Not gunfire, not a manhunt. Just one person with a badge and the power to take away another person's liberty over a legal standard she fundamentally misapplied. How many times a day does that exact scenario play out on roadsides where no body camera captures it, where no documentary channel ever pulls the footage, and where no department ever opens a formal review? The paper trail after the arrest tells its own story. The citations Officer Holbert issued for impeding traffic and failure to identify were reviewed and found invalid, submitted for dismissal before they ever reached a courtroom. That's not a technicality. That's an acknowledgement, on paper, that the charges should never have been filed. The Chief of Police issued Officer Holbert a formal charge letter alleging multiple policy violations. She submitted a written defense of her. And here's the part that should bother you more than the arrest itself. This wasn't a unique encounter for Officer Holbert. The case file references a prior, separate incident involving her conduct on duty, which means this wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment under pressure. It was a pattern, significant enough that a documentary channel had already covered her once before this arrest even occurred. Let's walk through the actual elements, the way a court would. Refuses to identify himself and resists at every turn. In Carl Jones's own account, given on camera, in real time, to the very supervisor he kept requesting, he is a man trying to navigate an unmarked, unstaffed obstruction with no officer present to direct him. And under Section 38.03, resisting arrest in Texas requires the use of force against the officer attempting the arrest, not verbal refusal, not asking for a supervisor, not declining to sit in a vehicle. Significant portions of the relevant footage are obscured. The department's review still concluded the underlying arrest itself was not justified in the first place, which means the resisting charge was built on top of a detention that should never have occurred. Who stopped when told to stop, backed up when told to back up, and only became confrontational after being told to hand over identification with no stated legal basis. Both of these accounts cannot be true. Only one of them survived contact with departmental review. Unwarranted. Sit with that word for a second, because it's not a word department investigators use lightly, and it's not a word that shows up in police paperwork unless something has gone seriously sideways. An officer arrested a man, charged him with 3 separate offenses, put him in a patrol car, and drove him to a station. And her own department, after reviewing the body camera footage, decided there was no lawful foundation for any of it. 2 sustained internal findings. 1 unwarranted arrest. 1 reckless pursuit. 1 termination. That is not a single bad day captured on a single camera. That is a documented trajectory, written entirely in the department's own internal record, independent of anything Carl Jones said, did, or recorded on his phone. Let's be fair to the full picture, because this channel doesn't deal in one-sided villains. Carl Jones was not a perfect actor in this encounter either. His decision to argue in the middle of an active roadway, rather than complying immediately and raising his objections afterward, was not the safest choice available to him. And his refusal to sit in the patrol vehicle once detained could plausibly have supported a narrower interference charge, even under the department's own findings. But the central, dispositive fact remains unchanged by any of that. The underlying detention that triggered everything afterward was, in the department's own words, unwarranted. Everything Carl Jones is criticized for doing happened only after he was placed in a situation that should never have existed. Reasonable in his core conduct, justified in demanding a supervisor, vindicated by the dismissed citations and the internal findings, but not without his own missteps in how he handled the confrontation itself. The badge does not get to define the law. Say it a third time, because it's the entire thesis of this case. Not Officer Holbert's badge, not any officer's badge, anywhere. The badge does not get to define the law. The statute does. The courts do. And when those two things diverge, the documented record eventually catches up. Sometimes 3 days later, sometimes a year later, but it catches up. If you want to verify any of this yourself, the formal charge letter, Officer Holbert's written response, and the supervisory investigation findings referenced in this video are part of the Crossroads Police Department's Public Internal Affairs Record for 2024, obtainable through a Texas Public Information Act request to the department. Pull it, read Sergeant Tyler's findings in full, and then tell us in the comments if an internal investigation concludes an arrest was unwarranted. Should the officer's citations and Bodycam footage be automatically referred to the local district attorney for independent review? Or should that decision stay entirely inside the department that just disciplined its own? If this case made you angry, made you think, or made you want to see what happens next time, hit like. Share this with someone who needs to see how these reviews actually work. Subscribe to Police Misconduct Case and turn on notifications, because we'll be back in this same department's files before long.